Some doors don't lead to rooms. They lead to people you were never supposed to meet. I remember the exact second it happened, because everything before that felt ordinary, and everything after didn't belong to me anymore. My shift had run late, the kind of late where the hotel hallways feel too quiet, like even the air has gone home for the night, and I was halfway down the service corridor, counting my steps just to stay awake, when I saw him. He wasn't supposed to be there. Guests didn't walk these halls, not the ones marked staff only in bold red letters, not the ones that required a keycard and a reason. But he moved like the sign didn't apply to him, like rules bent out of his way instead of stopping him. Tall, dark coat, steady pace. No hesitation. I should have turned around. I know that now. But there was something about the way he walked, controlled, deliberate, like every step meant something, and before I could think better of it, I followed. Just a few steps at first, then more. The door at the end of the hallway was already half open, lights spilling out in a thin line across the floor, and he slipped through without looking back. I reached it seconds later, my hand hovering over the metal handle, my pulse louder than my thoughts. I told myself I was just making sure everything was okay. That's what I told myself as I stepped inside. The door shut behind me with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, and when I turned, the handle didn't move. Locked. The air felt different in there, colder somehow, heavier, like I'd stepped into a place that didn't belong to the rest of the building. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. His. Slow. Measured. Getting closer. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat as he stopped at the far end of the hallway, still facing away from me, like he knew I was there without needing to check. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he turned. And when his eyes met mine, it didn't feel like I had followed him at all. It felt like I had just walked exactly where he expected me to be. I should have looked away, but I did not, and that was my second mistake, because the moment his eyes locked onto mine, I felt it. Something shift in the air, like the hallway itself had decided I did not belong here anymore. And yet I could not move, not forward, not back, just frozen with my hand still hovering near the useless door handle behind me while he studied me in complete silence. No rush, no confusion, just a calm certainty that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. And for a second I wondered if he was going to ask me who I was, or what I was doing there. Something normal, something human, but he did not. He just looked at me like I was a detail that had already been accounted for, like my presence was not an interruption but part of the plan, and that thought made my throat go dry. I finally found my voice, but it came out quieter than I expected. I said I was sorry, that I took a wrong turn, that I would leave, even though we both knew I could not. My fingers pressed harder against the handle, as if that would somehow make it unlock, but it stayed firm under my grip, unyielding, and the sound of my own breathing suddenly felt too loud in the narrow space. He took a step toward me, then another, slow enough that I could track every movement. The soft echo of his shoes against the polished floor measuring the distance between us like a countdown I did not agree to. And the closer he got, the more I noticed the sharp lines of his face. The way his expression did not change, the kind of control that does not need to prove itself. He stopped a few feet away, and for the first time I realized how tall he was, how easily he filled the space without trying. I told myself to stay calm, to explain, to fix this before it became something bigger than a simple mistake. But the words tangled in my head. He tilted his head slightly like he was listening to something I could not hear. Then his gaze flicked past me toward the door and back again in one smooth motion. And that was when I heard it too, a faint click. Somewhere outside, followed by footsteps that were not his and not mine more. Then one, approaching, controlled, deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belong to people who already know where they are going. My pulse spiked and I turned instinctively, but there was nothing to see. Just the closed door and my own reflection faintly staring back at me from the metal surface. When I faced him again, something in his expression had shifted, not softer, not harder, just more decided, like a conclusion had been reached. I shook my head before he could say anything, words rushing out now. I said I did not see anything, that I would not say anything, that I just needed to get back to work. The sentences felt small the moment they left my mouth, fragile against the weight of the silence he carried. The footsteps outside stopped right on the other side of the door, and for a split second everything went completely still, like the building itself was holding its breath. I felt it in my chest. That sharp instinct telling me I had crossed into something I could not step out of, not on my own. His eyes held mine the entire time, unblinking, unreadable. And then he spoke for the first time, his voice low and steady, not loud, not threatening, just certain in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He said you should not have followed. And the way he said it was not a question and not even a warning. It was a statement of fact, like gravity or time, something that simply was. I swallowed and nodded even though my body still would not move. And then, before I could respond, before I could try again to fix what I had already broken, the door behind me unlocked with a sharp click that made me flinch. It opened just enough for me to see shadows on the other side. Figures waiting, not rushing in, just standing there like they were waiting for a signal. I turned back to him one more time, hoping for something, an explanation, a way out, anything that would make this feel real again. But all I found was that same steady gaze, and in that moment I understood. Something I wish I had realized sooner. The door opening did not mean I was free to leave. It meant he had decided what happened next. The door opened wider behind me, but no. One stepped in. They just stood there in the shadow like they were waiting for permission that only one person in this hallway could give. And I felt it before I fully understood it, that whatever happened next did not depend on me anymore. My hand slowly dropped from the handle as I turned back toward him, my heart beating so loud it felt like it echoed off the walls. I told myself to speak again, to try one more time to turn this into something normal, something fixable, but the words felt smaller now, almost meaningless, because he had not moved, not even a fraction. He just stood there watching me like time worked differently for him, like he could wait forever if he wanted to. And that calm, that complete lack of urgency, made the space between us feel even tighter. I took a breath and said I needed to go back to my shift, that people would notice I was gone, that someone might come looking for me. It sounded reasonable in my head, but the moment I said it out loud, it felt like I was speaking into something much bigger than a simple conversation. His gaze did not break, did not soften. It just stayed fixed on me with that same quiet intensity. Then he stepped closer again, and I felt my back press lightly against the door without realizing I had moved. Not trapped exactly, but close enough that the distance between us felt intentional, controlled. His presence filled the hallway in a way that made everything else fade. The sound, the air, even my own thoughts slowed down. He glanced briefly toward the open door behind me, and the figures waiting there shifted slightly, not entering, not interrupting, just adjusting like they understood something I did not. Then his attention returned to me, and for the first time I noticed something else beneath the control, not emotion exactly, but focus, like he was deciding something carefully, measuring it. I swallowed and held his gaze even though every instinct told me to look away, because something in me refused to shrink, refused to disappear even when I knew I was completely out of my depth. Seconds stretched, and I could feel the weight of them building. Then one of the men outside the door spoke quietly, not loud. Enough to echo, just enough to be heard. A single question, unfinished, like he did not need to say more. And that was when it happened. He lifted his hand slightly, a small motion, almost nothing, but the effect was immediate. The voice outside went silent. The movement stopped. Everything paused again, as if that single gesture had rewritten the rules of the moment. I felt it in my chest. That shift of power so clear it did not need explanation. And then he looked back at me with that same steady gaze and said something that made the air feel even heavier. He said, "You do not belong here." And for a second I thought that was it, that he was going to let me walk out, that this would end the way it should have from the beginning. But there was something in the way he said it, not dismissive, not careless, just factual, like he was stating a condition that could still change. I opened my mouth to respond, but he stepped even closer, close enough now that I could feel the warmth of his presence against the cold air of the hallway, not touching, not invading, just there, undeniable, and my breath caught for a moment because the distance between us had become something else entirely, not just space but tension, possibility. He studied my face like he was searching for something specific, and I did not look away. I could not, even though I knew I should, even though every part of me understood that holding his gaze was its own kind of mistake. The silence stretched. Again, longer this time, heavier, until it felt like the entire moment balanced on a single decision. And then finally he spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost thoughtful. And he said, "But you stayed." And those 3 words landed differently. Not like an accusation, not like a question, but like a conclusion, like he had reached the answer he was looking for. And before I could process it, before I could decide whether to argue or agree or simply step away, he turned slightly toward the open door and gave the smallest nod. And that was when I understood. The hallway had never been locked to keep me out. It had been closed to see if I would walk in any way. The nod was small, but it changed everything. The men outside the door stepped forward at once, not rushing, not aggressive, just precise, like they had done this 100 times before, and suddenly the space that had felt empty was no longer mine. I felt it immediately, that shift from standing alone to being surrounded by something I did not understand. I took a step back instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The hallway that had seemed long now felt narrow, contained, and my pulse spiked again as one of them moved to the side, giving him a clear path toward me, not blocking, not interfering, just making space like he was the only one who mattered here. And he walked past me slowly, close enough that I could feel the faint movement of air as he did, not touching, not even brushing against me, but close enough to make my breath catch again. He stopped just beyond me and turned slightly, his voice calm, measured, directed not at me this time, but at the others, a few words I did not fully catch. Low and controlled, and the response was immediate. They moved into position without question, one by the door, one further down the hall, another stepping back as if to clear a path that did not exist a moment ago. I turned to follow his movement, trying to keep up, trying to understand, but everything felt half a step ahead of me, like I was reacting instead of choosing, and that realization made something inside me push back. I straightened slightly, forcing myself to speak again, louder. This time, clearer. I said I needed to go, that I was just an employee, that I had nothing to do with whatever this was. My voice echoed more than I expected, filling the space in a way that made the silence afterward even heavier. He did not respond right away. He just looked at me again, that same steady, unreadable gaze. And for a second I thought I had said the wrong thing, that I had pushed too far, but then something shifted. Not in the room, not in the others. In him, a subtle change in focus, like he was seeing me differently now, not as a mistake, not as a problem, but as something he had not expected, and that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant I was no longer just passing through. I was part of whatever decision he was making. He took a step toward me again and stopped close enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to meet his eyes. And this time when he spoke, it was directly to me. Quiet but clear. He said, "What is your name?" And the question caught me off guard because it felt almost normal, almost out of place in everything that had just happened. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, my voice softer now. I said, "Emily." And for the first time his expression shifted in a way I could not fully read, not softer, not warmer, just more focused, like the name mattered, like it fit into something I could not see. He repeated it once, quietly, like he was testing how it sounded, then nodded slightly, not to me but to himself, and the moment stretched again, that same heavy silence settling between us. But this time it felt different, less like a trap and more like a line being drawn. I realized then that nothing here was random, not the hallway, not the locked door, not even the fact that I had followed him in the first place. And that realization made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because it meant this was not just a mistake I could walk away from. It was something that had already begun before I understood it. One of the men shifted near the door again as if waiting for the next instruction, and I saw it clearly now, the way they watched him, the way they moved only after he did, the way the entire space seemed to revolve around his decisions. And suddenly the word formed in my mind without permission, not guest, not manager, something else entirely, something that explained the control, the certainty, the way nothing here happened without him allowing it. And I felt a chill run through me as the realization settled in. He was not just someone who belonged here. He was the reason this place existed the way it did. And when his eyes met mine again, I knew with a certainty that made it hard to breathe that whatever came next was not about whether I could leave. It was about whether he was going to let me. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. Not empty, but filled with something I could not name. Like the air itself was waiting for his decision to take shape. And I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to, standing there with every instinct telling me to leave and every reality showing me that I could not. Not yet. Not until he allowed it. He watched me for a few seconds longer, as if measuring something invisible. Then he turned slightly and began walking down the hallway without saying a word, just a subtle motion of his hand as he passed one of the men near the door. And that was all it took. They shifted immediately, not touching me, not forcing me, just repositioning in a way that made it clear there was only one direction left to go, forward. After him, I hesitated for half a second, long enough to feel the weight of that choice settle in. Because following him now was not curiosity anymore. It was something else entirely. Something closer to stepping into a space I did not understand. But staying behind did not feel like an option either. The hallway behind me no longer felt like an exit. It felt closed, finished, so I moved, one step at a time, keeping a careful distance as I followed him. The sound of my shoes softer now against the floor, almost swallowed by the quiet control of everything around me. The farther we walked, the more the hallway changed. The lights brighter, the air cooler, the walls no longer plain but lined with doors that looked identical, clean, seamless, like they hid more than they revealed. And I found myself noticing details I would have ignored before. The faint scent of something expensive in the air. The way the lighting did not flicker or hum, but stayed perfectly steady. The kind of control that suggested nothing here was left to chance. He stopped in front of one of the doors without looking back, and for a moment nothing happened. Then it opened automatically with a soft, almost silent motion, and the space beyond it was nothing like the hallway. It was larger, warmer, designed with a kind of quiet precision that made it feel less like part of the hotel and more like something separate, private. He stepped inside first and paused just enough for me to enter after him. And again I hesitated, that same instinct flaring up, telling me that crossing this threshold meant something, that it was not just another step, but a line I would not be able to uncross. But the men behind me had already taken position again, not pushing, not speaking, just present, and that was enough. I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with the same soft finality as before, sealing the moment in place. I turned slightly, taking in the room, trying to ground myself in something familiar, but nothing here felt ordinary. Everything was too deliberate, too controlled, like every object had been chosen for a reason. And when I looked back at him, he was already watching me, that same steady gaze. But now there was something else beneath it, something closer to intent. Like this was the moment he had been moving toward from the beginning. I swallowed and forced myself to speak again, quieter this time, but more certain. I said I really need to go back, that people would notice, that I did not belong here. And the words felt different now, less like an argument and more like a reminder. To him or to myself I was not sure. He listened without interrupting, without reacting, and when I finished he took a single step closer, closing the distance just enough to shift the space between us again. And then he said something that made everything else fade for a second. His voice calm, controlled, certain in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. He said, "You are already here." And the way he said it was not about location, not about the room or the hallway or the building. It was about something else entirely, something I could feel settling around me like a quiet truth I had not chosen but could no longer ignore. And in that moment, I understood that leaving was no longer the question I should be asking. The real question was why he had brought me here. In the first place, the way he said it stayed with me. Not loud, not forceful, just certain, like a fact that did not need to be argued. And for a moment, I could not find a response that felt strong enough to push against it. I stood there in the center of a room that did not belong to my world, trying to hold on to something familiar, something that reminded me who I was before I stepped into that hallway. I straightened my shoulders slightly and forced myself to meet his gaze again, because looking away now felt like giving up something I did not fully understand. I told him again that this was a mistake, that I had work, that I had responsibilities that existed outside of whatever this was. And this time my voice did not shake. It stayed steady, grounded in something real, something mine. And for a second I thought that might matter, that maybe it would shift something in him. But he did not interrupt. He did not dismiss me either. He just listened in that same controlled silence that made every word feel heavier than it should have. When I finished, he moved past me slowly, not brushing against me, but close enough that I could feel the presence of him in the air. He walked toward a table near the far wall and poured a glass of water without asking if I wanted one. Then he set it down within reach, not offering it directly, just placing it there like it was expected that I would take it if I needed to. That small action caught me off guard more than anything else had, because it was not force, it was not control, it was something quieter, something deliberate, and I found myself stepping closer before I even realized I had decided to. My hand hovered over the glass for a moment before I picked it up, the coolness grounding me slightly as I took a small sip. The silence stretched again, but it no longer felt as sharp as before, more like something waiting to be filled. I set the glass down carefully and looked back at him, and that was when I noticed it. The way his attention had shifted, not away from me but deeper, like he was studying more than just what was in front of him. I asked him what this was, not the room, not the hallway, but all of it, why I was here, why he had not just let me leave when he could have. The question felt simple, but the weight behind it was not. He did not answer right away. Instead, he moved closer again, stopping at a distance that felt intentional, not too close, not distant, just enough to hold the space between us in place. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more measured. He said, "You followed without knowing what you were stepping into." And there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he was not just talking about the hallway anymore. I frowned slightly, not fully understanding, and told him that was exactly why I should be allowed to leave, that it was an accident, that I did not belong in whatever world he was part of. And for the first time there was a pause in him, not hesitation, but consideration, like he was weighing something I could not see. His gaze moved over my face briefly, not intrusive, just focused. And then he said something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. He said, "Accidents do not walk forward after the door closes," and I felt that settle into me. Because he was right. I had followed. I had stepped in. I had stayed even when something in me said to turn back. And now I was here, standing in front of him in a space that did not exist in my life before tonight. I shook my head slightly, trying to hold on to my reasoning, telling him that curiosity did not mean consent, that making a wrong turn did not mean I should be kept here. And this time something shifted again, subtle but real. His expression did not change much, but there was a flicker of something behind it, something closer to interest, like I had said something unexpected, something that did not fit into whatever pattern he was used to. And the room felt different again, not safer, not more dangerous, just more defined, like the lines of whatever this was were becoming clearer. He took one more step closer, and this time the distance between us narrowed just enough to make my breath catch. Not from fear, but from the intensity of it, the focus, the certainty in the way he held my gaze. And then he said quietly, "You are not being kept." And for a second I almost believed that meant I was free to go. But then he finished the sentence, his voice steady, unshakable. He said, "You are being considered." And those words stayed in the air between us, heavier than anything else he had said so far. Because they did not explain anything. They changed everything. The words settled into me slower than everything else he had said, not because I did not understand them, but because I did, too clearly, and that made them harder to ignore. Being considered was not the same as being free. It was not even the same as being kept. It meant I was somewhere in between, in a space where the outcome had not been decided yet, and that uncertainty pressed in on me in a way that made it difficult to breathe. I let out a quiet breath and shook my head slightly, trying to steady myself, trying to hold on to something that still made sense. I told him I was not something to be considered, that I was just a person who had made a wrong turn, that whatever decision he thought he needed to make about me was unnecessary. My voice stayed calm, but there was an edge to it now, something firmer, something that refused to be reduced to a situation I did not choose. He watched me as I spoke, not interrupting, not dismissing, just listening in that same focused way that made every word feel like it mattered more than it should. When I finished, the silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, less like pressure and more like tension, like something was building beneath the surface. He stepped slightly to the side, creating just enough space between us that I could breathe easier. But his presence did not fade. It never did. He moved toward the far side of the room and rested his hand lightly against the edge of the table, not leaning, not relaxing, just grounding himself there, as if the position itself had meaning. And then he spoke again, his voice measured, almost thoughtful. He said most people would have tried to leave the moment that door locked, and there was no accusation in it, just observation. I frowned slightly and told him I did try, that I had reached for the handle, that I had said I wanted to go. And something flickered in his expression again, subtle but real. He nodded once, as if acknowledging the truth of that, then added quietly, "But you did not stop there." And that was where the conversation shifted, because he was right again. I had not stopped. I had stayed. I had followed. I had kept going even when it did not make sense. I crossed my arms slightly, more to hold myself steady than anything else, and told him that staying did not mean I belonged here, that it did not give him the right to decide anything about me. The words came out stronger this time, more certain, and for a moment the room felt still again, like everything was waiting to see how he would respond. He looked at me for a long second, not reacting immediately, just taking in what I had said, and then he pushed off the table and stepped closer again, not abruptly, not aggressively, just deliberately, the distance between us narrowing once more until it felt like the space itself was part of the conversation. His gaze held mine with that same steady intensity, but now there was something else behind it. Something sharper, something that felt like a decision forming. He said quietly, "I do not decide anything about you." And for a split second, I almost felt relief, like maybe this was the moment everything would shift back to normal. But then he continued, his voice just as calm, just as certain. He said, "I decide what happens around you." And that distinction landed differently, heavier, because it did not contradict me. It reframed everything. I felt my breath catch again, not from fear, but from the realization of what that meant, that I was standing in a place where the rules were not mine, where the outcome did not depend on what I wanted but on what he allowed. And yet, even with that understanding, something in me refused to back down. I met his gaze again and said that did not change who I was, that it did not change the fact that I did not belong in this world. And this time the silence that followed was not empty at all. It was full, charged with something I could not fully name. He studied me for a moment longer, and then, without breaking eye contact, he said something that made everything else fade again, his voice lower now, more certain than before. He said, "Maybe you do not belong to it." And then after a brief pause he added, "But it noticed you anyway." And those words settled into the space between us like a quiet shift in gravity, because they did not feel like an argument. They felt like the beginning of something I had not seen coming. The words stayed with me longer than they should have. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and certain in a way that made them harder to shake. And for the first time since I stepped into that hallway, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Like I had crossed into something that was already moving before I understood it. I let out a slow breath and looked away for a second, not to break from him, but to gather myself. Because standing there under that steady gaze made it too easy to lose track of my own thoughts. I told myself to stay grounded, to remember where I came from. The normal world outside these walls where things made sense and choices belonged to me. I lifted my head again and met his eyes, holding them this time with more intention. And I said that being noticed did not mean anything, that it did not give him the right to decide where I fit. My voice was steady, not loud, but firm enough to carry through the room. And for a brief moment, I thought that might be enough to push the moment back into something I could control. But he did not react the way I expected. He did not argue or dismiss it. Instead, he watched me with a kind of focus that felt deeper than before, like I had just confirmed something rather than challenged it. He took a step closer again, slower this time, deliberate in a way that made every inch of distance feel measured. And when he stopped, the space between us felt different, not smaller but more defined. Like it had meaning now. He tilted his head slightly, studying me in silence for a second before speaking again, his voice calm, almost quiet. He said, "Most people do not question what they cannot see." And there was something in the way he said it that made me pause, not because I agreed, but because I understood what he meant. This world, whatever it was, existed beneath the surface, hidden in plain sight, and most people never looked twice. I frowned slightly and told him that did not make it right, that staying hidden did not make something acceptable. And again that subtle shift passed through him, not irritation, not surprise, just something closer to interest, like the conversation itself had taken a direction he had not planned. He stepped past me then, moving toward the far side of the room with that same controlled pace, and I turned instinctively to follow his movement, not because I had to, but because I needed to understand what he was doing, what he was thinking. He stopped near a panel on the wall and rested his hand lightly against it, not pressing anything, just standing there for a second like he was considering something beyond the room itself. Then he looked back at me and said quietly, "This is not about right or wrong." And I felt that land in a way I did not expect, because it meant the rules I was holding on to did not apply here, not in the way I understood them. I shook my head slightly, refusing to let that settle too easily, telling him that everything was about right or wrong, that choices mattered no matter where you stood. And for the first time, there was a pause that felt longer than the others, not empty but thoughtful, like he was actually weighing what I had said instead of simply moving past it. His gaze stayed on me, steady, unreadable, and then he said something that made my chest tighten. Again, his voice low but clear, he said, "That is exactly why you are still here." And I felt the meaning of that before I could fully process it, because it was not about the hallway or the door or the mistake anymore. It was about me, about the fact that I had not backed down, that I had questioned, that I had stayed present even when everything told me to retreat. I swallowed and took a small step back, not to create distance but to steady myself, because the conversation had shifted again, deeper than before, and I was no longer just reacting. I was part of it. I asked him what that meant, what he was deciding, and this time he did not answer immediately. He held my gaze for a long second, then moved closer once more, stopping just within that same measured distance that had come to define everything between us. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same quiet certainty. He said, "It means you were not supposed to be here." And I felt a brief flicker of relief, like maybe this was the moment everything would reset. But then he finished the thought without breaking eye contact. He said, "And yet you are exactly where you needed to be." And those words settled into the space between us like something final, something that did not ask for agreement, only recognition. And in that moment, I understood that whatever this was, it was no longer about whether I had made a wrong turn. It was about what he believed that wrong turn had revealed. For a moment, I could not say anything, not because I did not have words, but because none of them felt strong enough to stand against what he had just said. The certainty in his voice did not leave space for argument. It did not demand agreement either. It simply existed. And that was what made it harder to push back against. I felt it settle somewhere deeper than logic, somewhere instinctive, like a truth I had not chosen but could not ignore. I drew in a slow breath and shook my head slightly, trying to hold on to something that still belonged to me, something untouched by whatever this was. I told him that being in the wrong place at the wrong time did not mean anything more than that it did not change who I was or where I belonged. My voice stayed steady, but there was a quiet tension beneath it now, something that came from standing my ground even when I was not sure it would matter. He listened again without interrupting, his gaze fixed on me with that same unshakable focus. And for a second I thought he might dismiss it, that he would simply move past my words the way he had before, but he did not. Instead, he took a step closer, just one, enough to shift the space between us again. And I felt my breath catch despite myself, not from fear but from the intensity of it, the way he held the moment in place like nothing else could interrupt it. He studied me for a long second, longer than before, and there was something different in it now, something more resolved, like whatever he had been considering had reached its end. I felt it before he spoke, that shift from possibility to decision. And when he finally did, his voice was as calm as it had always been, but there was no uncertainty left in it. He said quietly, "You think this is about where you walked?" And I frowned slightly, not understanding where he was going with that. And he continued without breaking eye contact, his tone steady, deliberate. He said, "It is not." And the simplicity of that made it land harder than anything else, because it stripped away the explanation I had been holding on to since the beginning. I felt my chest tighten as I tried to find something to respond with, something that would put this back into a shape I recognized. But before I could speak, he took another small step forward, closing the distance just enough that the moment felt fully contained. And then he said, "It is about the fact that you did not turn around." And that was it. That was the line that everything else seemed to connect to. Not the hallway, not the locked door, not even him, but me, my choice, the one I had not thought mattered, the one I had made without understanding what it would lead to. I swallowed slowly, my mind trying to catch up, trying to make sense of how something so small could feel this significant. I told him that did not change anything, that people make decisions without knowing the outcome all the time, that it did not mean those decisions were meant to happen. And this time when he looked at me, there was no shift, no flicker, just certainty, complete and unshaken. He held my gaze and said quietly, "Sometimes it does." And the way he said it made the room feel still again, like everything had settled into place. I felt it then, not fully understanding but aware in a way I had not been before, that whatever this was had already moved, past the point of being undone. I took a small step back, more to steady myself than to create distance. And for the first time since this began, I did not immediately try to argue. I just stood there, taking in the weight of it, the quiet gravity of the moment. He watched me for another second and then finally moved, not away from me, but past me, heading toward the door with that same controlled pace. And as he reached it, he paused, his hand resting lightly against the frame before he turned his head just enough to look back at me. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same calm authority, but now it felt final, like the end of something and the beginning of something else. At the same time, he said, "You can leave." And for a split second, relief hit me so fast it almost made me dizzy. But then he added, without hesitation, without raising his voice, just as certain as everything else he had said, he said, "But you will come back." And those words stayed in the air long after he turned away, long after the door opened, long after the path in front of me was finally clear, because deep down, in a place I had not wanted to acknowledge, I knew he was not making a prediction. He was stating a truth I had not yet admitted to myself.